Clock says it's straight up 12 noon. We'd like to welcome everyone to the I-29 Moo University Dairy webinar series. Our topic for today is why conformation matters in our dairy herds. In this webinar, Dr. Jeffrey Bewley will discuss how conformation relates to Holstein milk production and lifespan. Dr. Bewley was an extension dairy specialist at University of Kentucky and is currently a dairy analytics and innovation scientist with Holstein Association USA. Dr. Bewley, we welcome you to the program, and as I always say, the podium is yours.
All right, thank you, Fred. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with your group today. Looking forward to sharing with you what we learned in our study about conformation and how it relates to economically important outcomes. So conformation is a topic that I think is interesting to many of us and is one that perhaps has some controversy because we all have that question about what should the ideal dairy cow look like? And you can see in the picture here, the ideal Holstein. This is the official model for what the ideal Holstein should look like. It's a topic that's highly debated with lots of different opinions among professionals and producers in the dairy industry. And a lot of us get that discussion or focus from our experiences either in dairy judging or perhaps in the show ring. And linear type classification programs have been designed specifically to quantify linear traits and physical conformation. And as we look at the Holstein breed or any other breed for that matter, the emphasis or the amount of emphasis that's placed on conformation has changed over time. It's really quite amazing when you look at what we've been able to do through natural selection in changing the conformation of that Holstein animal. On the left, you see a picture of one of the first Holstein animals that was imported in 1880 into the United States. And on the right, you see a picture of a rather famous show cow right now that's highly scored and has done really well in the show ring. And you see an animal that looks very different, right? So she's taller, she's certainly bigger, perhaps a bit more angular, much better udder conformation, fore-udder teat placement. If you looked behind, you'd see a lot better in the rear udder also, and probably even better feet and legs. So there's a lot of really nice things about the animal on the right compared to the animal on the left. Why would we even care about this topic? Why does conformation matter? Well, ultimately, it's because there are effects that have impact on things that are economically important to dairy producers. Udder conformation, for example, affects longevity, mastitis, and how well the animal works within the parlor or within the robot. Foot and leg conformation affects mobility and longevity of the animal. Dairy form and strength affect the production capacity of the animal. And ultimately, functionally correct animals simply last longer and milk more across their lifetimes. The topic and how important it is varies a lot around the industry. So there are some folks today that would say conformation really doesn't matter. We've selected for an animal that does as well as what she can, and currently the way we are, we don't need to focus on conformation anymore. In the middle, perhaps, there's the idea that functional conformation improves profitability. And then on the right, where people are really, really focused on conformation, and in fact, maybe focused on show-winning conformation. And this creates some controversy because people have different goals at some points. Now, before I get into the study that we did, I want to give you a little bit of my background in that I grew up on a dairy here in Kentucky where we didn't have any registered animals. This picture of my grandfather and a picture of me milking our grade animals at the dairy here in Kentucky, Holstein animals, but we didn't focus on conformation really at all. And I remember when I went into high school, I heard about people that were showing cows, and I thought that sounded like something I might want to do. And I went to my grandfather and I suggested that I'd like to start showing animals. And he told me to ask all my friends if they made money while they were showing animals. And I asked all my friends, and I came back and I said, well, I figured out that they all said they lose money. They don't make money on that venture, but I'd still like to do it anyway. And he told me that I needed to go back to milking cows because that's where we made money. So that was the beginning and the end of my show ring experience. And I tell you this to tell you that when I came into this study, I came in with a bias that probably we wouldn't find a lot here, that conformation might not matter as much as people thought, because that was my background. My background was not in an area that I thought conformation mattered. But we set out to study this in more depth. And what we did was we wanted to look at the relationships between conformation and linear traits with some economically important outcomes. The economically important outcomes that we chose to examine were first, lactation energy corrected milk, lifetime energy corrected milk, longevity, and somatic cell score. So those were our objectives for this study. And we had a rather large data set where we had classification scores, including linear traits. For the study, we used the first classification score that was assigned to an animal during her first lactation, because we wanted to make sure that we were working with the most unbiased data set possible. And we used official DHI records for production and culling data. We looked at cows born after 1990 and lactations that started between 2000 and 2021. For lifetime production, we only looked at the first 6 lactations, and a few other details here that probably are just for those that are really into the science of it. We ended up with a little less than 1 million cows in the data set, so it's a rather large data set, and 5,500 unique herds that were represented in the data set. And one of the things that we did for the final analysis was we made sure that every animal that was included in the analysis, she had to have at least 5 herd mates in that herd in that year, in that season of calving, to be included, because we wanted to make sure that she had contemporary animals to be compared against. And what this edit does is it really removes a lot of the animals in small herds where there might be potential for more selection bias. And certainly there's no way to remove all selection bias, but by going toward larger herds, we were more likely to see that these animals remained in the herd for production and profitability reasons. We divided animals into quartiles, and you can see a little bit more information about the analysis that we did. Again, that's probably not something we need to go into a lot of depth here, but we did a thorough analysis accounting for many factors within that analysis. So what did we find? I was really surprised at the relationships that we found. First of all, let's set up the graph that we have here. On our y-axis, we have the first lactation 305-day energy corrected milk yield. And on the x-axis, we have the cow's final score. So this is the score that includes everything that we might look at for conformation. And what you see here is that there's a stepwise increase in first lactation energy corrected milk as we increase in the final score that animal received in her first lactation. The highest scored animals averaged a little less than 25,000, and the lowest scored animals were less than 23,000. In total, that's about an 1,800 pound range in milk production. And at $20 milk, that's $360 difference in milk revenue between the highest scored and the lowest scored animals in the herd. Then we looked at lifetime energy corrected milk, and I think these results are even more striking. What you see here is that the difference between those highest scored animals and the lowest scored animals is almost 30,000 pounds difference. And at $20 milk, that's a $5,700 difference in milk revenue. So animals that were scored higher, in other words, they were closer to the ideal of what a Holstein should look like, they provided us with a lot more milk revenue in their lives. A whole 29,000 pounds difference in milk revenue between the best and the worst. And again, you can see it's a stepwise increase as we move from left to right on that graph from each category for final score. A big part of that difference comes because these animals that have a higher final score, they simply stay in the herd longer. As we look at this, the top group again, they averaged 955 lifetime days in milk, and the bottom group 679. So almost a full lactation range difference between the best and the worst animals. So we almost got another full lactation out of those animals. That's why they were able to milk more, because they just stayed in the herd longer. Another way of looking at the length of life in the herd or lifespan in the herd is we see here that those animals that were in that highest category, 36% of them made it to 6 years old, and only 12% of that bottom group made it to 6 years old. We also looked at somatic cell score, and probably not surprisingly, the differences here were much smaller. But again, we see that those animals with the lowest scores had significantly higher somatic cell scores in their first lactation than the animals in the top three groups. Another thing that we wanted to do was assess which traits were the most influential for our economically important outcomes. So you can see here we have correlations with first lactation 305-day energy corrected milk with our various linear traits. Rear udder width was the most correlated with 305-day energy corrected milk, followed by dairy form, so basically the angularity of that animal, followed by udder depth, which was negative, basically saying that animals with deeper udders produce more milk in their first lactation. Then body depth and strength, rear height, stature, and foot angle. When we look at a trait like rear legs side view, we have to keep in mind that this is really a trait where we want an intermediate optimum. We don't want animals that are too posty-legged, but we also don't want animals that have too much set to their legs. And when we keep that in mind, that correlations really are not designed for nonlinear relationships, so probably can't interpret much in that. You can see here some of the other traits don't show a lot of relationship with 305-day energy corrected milk. Now, when we look at the relationships with somatic cell score, you see, not surprisingly, that most of the relationships are with udder traits, and they're negative because that basically we want a lower somatic cell score. So what this says, for example, on the top is that udder depth has a negative correlation with somatic cell score, meaning animals with more shallow udders have a lower somatic cell score. Animals with a better forudder attachment have a lower somatic cell score. Same with udder cleft and front teeth placement. Now, keep in mind these relationships, these correlations are really not all that high on this one. Then we wanted to look at what was the correlation between these linear traits and culling age. So what factors attributed the most to how long that animal stayed in the herd? Forudder attachment was the highest ranking trait, followed by rear udder height, udder depth, rear udder width, foot angle, thorough width, and dairy form. So these animals need to have good udders, good foot angle, and they need to look like dairy animals. And then we look at probably what I find the most interesting and most useful is lifetime energy corrected milk. So I want an animal that stays in the herd for a long time, but also she produces a lot of milk for me. Rear udder height and rear udder width were the most correlated with lifetime energy corrected milk, followed by fore udder attachment, dairy form, foot angle, and udder cleft. Then we get and really start to see that most of the body traits really aren't that related to lifetime energy corrected milk. We also have some breakdowns for different trait categories. So dairy strength, for example, here we see that animals that are in the highest quartile for dairy strength produce more milk in their first lactation than animals in the lower quartiles. When we look at rear legs side view, we see that actually what we would expect to see, that the optimum is in the middle. So animals that don't have too much set but are not too posty-legged, those are the ones that produce the most milk in their first lactation, although these differences are pretty small. In this slide, we see that the feet and leg breakdown. So this is overall assessment of feet and legs. Those animals with the best feet and legs produce the most milk in their first lactation. When we look at first lactation, the taller animals do produce the most milk in their first lactation. Now, we're going to come back and talk about stature a little bit differently when we get to lifetime energy corrected milk, but the animals that are taller in their first lactation, they do produce more milk. Then we see dairy form. Again, pretty dramatic differences here. Those animals that are more angular, less beefy looking, produce more milk in their first lactation than animals that are less dairy. See the same trends for rear udder height. The higher rear udders produce more milk. The wider rear udders produce more milk in the first lactation. When we look at this on a lifetime basis, the fore udder attachment really starts to come through, that these animals with the strongest fore udder attachments have the most lifetime energy corrected milk, and a bit more of a steeper drop off here. That bottom group drops off quite a bit. So the really loose fore udder attachments are the ones that maybe have less of an opportunity to produce large amounts of milk across their lifetime. Rear udder height, again, we see that increase, but the biggest challenge and the biggest thing here is that it's the ones that really are lacking in rear udder height that are producing less in their lifetime. The top three categories, realistically, probably not all that different. Same story for rear udder width, where we have the top category again being the widest rear udders, but the big drop off coming here for the really low, really narrow rear udders. Udder cleft, really no differences biologically, no differences between the top three quartiles of animals, but that bottom quartile of animals, the ones that really are lacking in cleft, is where we see a drop off in lifetime energy corrected milk. For foot angle, similarly, we see not a lot of difference between the top three quartiles, but those animals in the lowest quartile produce considerably less milk than those animals in the higher three categories. Again, same story for dairy form. It's the animals that are really lacking in dairy form, the ones that perhaps look a little bit beefier, that produce less lifetime energy corrected milk. Not really any big differences among these top three categories. Udder breakdown, again, the best uddered animals produce the most in their lifetime. Feet and leg breakdown, the animals with the best feet and legs produce more across their lifetime. Rump angle, one that has quite a bit of debate, but we see that the optimum here is in the middle again. We don't want a rump that's too sloped, but we don't want a rump that's too high or compared to where the pins are much higher than the hooks either. Stature. I told you we would get a little bit different story on stature when we looked at lifetime energy corrected milk. And here's that story. Really no differences between the three lower categories for stature, but when we get to these animals that are really tall in their first lactation, they actually produce less lifetime energy corrected milk. So even though they might be producing more more first lactation energy corrected milk, they produce less in their lifetime. Jim asked the question about, was the information that showed that first lactation cows were taller adjusted for animal age, or could the taller animal just be older and more mature? It was not adjusted. It is possible that those taller animals were older and more mature. Great point. So rear legs, side view, that's the one we were talking about a minute ago. Foot angle, again, no differences in the top three categories, but the really, really low foot angles are where we start to have a problem. This graph shows that animals with better feet and legs last longer than animals with less desirable feet and legs. And that stair steps across the four quartiles. Rear leg side view, those animals in the middle last longer than animals in either extreme, either posty or sickle-legged. Here we show the stature relationship again, and what we're seeing probably coming out in the lifetime energy corrected milk. Those tallest animals, we start to see a decrease in how long they stay in the herd. Udder breakdown, percentage of animals in the herd after 6 years. 35% of the animals that are greater than 82, the top quartile for udder breakdown, are still in the herd. Only 21% in that bottom quartile. Similarly, for feet and legs, 34% of the animals in the top quartile are still in the herd after 6 years, and only 23% are still in the herd for that bottom category. When we start looking at all the udder traits together, what we call udder breakdown, then we do see some more differences with somatic cell score, but not really in those top three categories. So it doesn't have to be that they're really, really fancy and perfect udders, but when we start to fall apart, when we have a lot of problems with the udder, that's where we see a decrease, or sorry, an increase in somatic cell score. Fore-udder attachment, same story. It's the animals with the weakest fore-udder attachment where we see a difference. Not much difference between the top three categories for fore-udder attachment. Udder cleft, same story. The bottom category is where we see an increase in somatic cell score. Udder depth, bottom category, an increase in somatic cell score. So the take-home message here is that with udder traits and a lot of feet and leg traits, it's not necessarily that they have to be perfect, that they have to be in the top category for score, but that they're just not in the worst category. So they're still really important traits, but we don't see that full relationship until we break it down into more categories to see that it's the lowest animals or the worst animals that we see a difference in performance. So some things to keep in mind when we look at this data set. Keep in mind, these are phenotypic and not genetic relationships. Recognize that correlation does not equal causation. Just because we see this relationship doesn't mean that one causes the other. And of course, there are many other management factors that affect the outcomes from these relationships. So production is not just about dairy form, or somatic cell score is not just about udder cleft. There's a lot of other things that go into that happen on the farm beyond the genetics. And also keep in mind that the genetic evaluations do already account for milk yield potential, productive life, and somatic cell score. So from this study, we conclude that physical conformation does matter. And I was really surprised at how striking some of these relationships are. The classification system does quantify these economically important differences well. And this is a data set with almost 1 million cows in over 5,000 herds across 20 years. That's a pretty big data set. It's not that we just did this in 1 or 2 herds. This is a large data set that we're working on for this information. And hopefully this helps drive home the importance of classification and the value of individual traits for economically important indicators. So just as a review, what are the traits that were most important for lifetime energy corrected milk? Rear udder height, rear udder width, fore udder attachment, dairy form, foot angle, and udder cleft. These are the traits that were the most important impacts for lifetime energy corrected milk. So how can we use that? Well, we need to recognize that type and conformation should probably be considered in our breeding decisions. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we're breeding for tall show cows. I think that's where the word type maybe has gotten a little bit of a negative connotation among some people, as people say, well, I'm not trying to breed a show winning animal. That's fine. Type isn't just about winning the show. Type is about producing functionally correct animals that are designed to stay in the herd longer and produce more milk. So these traits should be considered in breeding and culling decisions. Udder, feet and legs, and dairy form have a clear impact on lifetime profitability. And conformation traits should be considered in combination with production and fitness traits using an index like TPI, net merit, or daughter wellness profit dollars. It's not the only thing to think about, but something to think about within your genetic selection strategies. And this classification data provides with an additional decision-making criteria in the dairy data toolbox. So thank you so much for your attention today. I'm happy now to answer any questions that the group might have about our study on conformation in Holstein animals.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bewley. We do have several questions. Jim just put in, is the Holstein Association going to use this to change any of the indexes or TPI?
Good question. We are currently undergoing a review of conformation in a much more in-depth manner. So there are things going on toward that goal, toward that objective. Not just this study, but some additional studies that we're looking at and just doing a review of conformation overall. So there are efforts underway. This particular study is part of that effort, but not the whole effort.
Very good. For me, to kind of drill down on some other influences and variables, did you see any facility differences? The cow in the box stall versus the working gal out in the free stalls?
We didn't have that information on the herds. I'm sure that there would be some genotype by environment interactions there, that some animals probably are better in some facilities than the other. Most of these, I think, would be probably freestall herds or open lot herds that are in the final study. But that's a good point. There are definitely potential for differences among facility type.
Looking across our guests for this afternoon, I see some folks are involved with crossbreeding. Do you see these type or conformation traits change as we look at these non-full-blood Holsteins? And is there something in the works to help put that kind of data together for these crossbreds?
I think that the concepts hold true across crossbreds and other breeds. There's nothing here probably that's earth-shattering in terms of results. So I think it should be considered in crossbreeding also. And the base of any good crossbreeding program is the availability of high genetic merit animals within the base breeds. So if we take, for example, and say udder conformation is important for Holsteins, then udder conformation in theory should be good for crossbreds also. And so when selecting the Holstein sires to use on the Jersey animals or Montbéliard animals or whatever, then considering the udder traits within that selection would help to breed for an udder that's better on a crossbred animal. So I think the concepts still apply, and there's plenty of availability of bulls and females from all breeds that meet that criteria.
Okay. Are you running correlations of the conformation traits to PL?
We didn't specifically here. Our focus was on phenotypes, not genotype. So we looked at the phenotype. The way we looked at productive life was looking at lifetime days in milk and percentage of animals that survived to 6 years of age.
Okay. Jim followed up and said, for example, udder traits, feet and legs, or will it be actually the reproduction?
I'm sure there's some interactions there among all of that. The productive life, the genetic trait has an impact on those things too. There's too many interactions for me to answer that question totally off the cuff, but I'm sure that there is something there.
Okay. To drill down, Trent asked, what were the correlations with PL and PTAM for the EMC and lifetime milk since the linear traits and then it ends were roughly? So I'm not certain what else is there, but did you see any correlation effects?
We didn't look at PTA milk. We looked specifically at the phenotypic relationships here. PTA milk would be the genetic relationship.
Okay. Trent, if you want to go ahead and put the rest of that into your chat box, we'll try to be a little more specific. One other question, did you review any other health other than somatic cell? Did you collect data on lameness or breeding?
That's part of the next effort where I said earlier that we were conducting more in-depth analysis. That's part of what we're going to strive to do in the next effort.
Okay. If we have any other questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box, or we're a small enough group, go ahead and unmute and ask the question directly. I want to remind folks that this program has been recorded and will be archived at the Iowa State Dairy Team website. I will send an email out to everyone once it's up and ask to, in addition, take a short survey. It's only 4 questions, but they'll help us to continue to improve these programs.
So Jeffrey, what surprised you the most of all of the things you saw? What were you kind of surprised by, or was it, sort of not surprised and kind of within what the range of what you thought you would see?
I think the magnitude of differences was what surprised me the most. That there were much bigger differences in the relationships between both linear traits and final score with first lactation milk, lifetime milk, and longevity than I anticipated. So I really didn't expect to see that big of differences that we saw. In addition, perhaps a little bit surprised at some of the linear traits and how they fell out and ranked. So for example, rear udder height and rear udder width really clearly come to the top as traits of importance, and that perhaps the body traits weren't as important as what some folks might think that they are. Although I do think that the stature relationship that was observed is really important to think about, particularly with regards to how stature affects longevity and lifetime energy corrected milk, that maybe we want to avoid those really, really tall cows.
Hey, Amber put into the chat a brief analysis on the top 10% of PL available bulls within the industry. and notes that it's based on the current proof run.
Thank you.
So if we have additional questions, you can unmute and ask. Otherwise, we will be closing the program down. Not seeing any questions coming in. Dr. Bewley, thank you very much for going over this research with us. We appreciate the information, and I'm certain people will take this information home and kind of mull over it and stop putting it to work for them. So,
Thanks for having me.
Fred?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. Dr. Bewley, it's been my observation a little bit that the Holstein classifiers are being a little more not in favor of extreme type in their scores. And I think if you look at some of the Holstein charts, that is encouraged. I'm not sure what that's all going to do, because it doesn't appear to me that the show ring has decreased stature emphasis that much. Your comments, your thoughts.
I think that the show ring sometimes is a different animal altogether than perhaps what we might think about for most of the animals that are never going to enter the show ring, and so may reflect a little bit difference in opinion as far as what that animal should look like sometimes. We're trying to take a very data-based approach to assessing where the optimals are for conformation, and trying to think about it in terms of how does it affect economically important indicators. Our classifiers do a great job, and they're constantly educating themselves on what works best, and we're constantly working on refining our protocols to help improve some of those challenges that you might see observed.
Any other questions? Hearing and seeing none. Dr. Bewley, thank you again for your presentation, and we invite folks to come back next month for the I-29 University Dairy webinar. Thank you.
Thank you all.